Today, we're checking out a somewhat modern CPU from the 1300s, the Intel Celeron G470. This is the fastest single-core CPU, and it's also the newest single-core CPU. This CPU has 1 core, 2 threads, and it's also 2 GHz. Without further ado, let's try to game on it. This will definitely go well. I'm using Windows 10 as the operating system, and I know some people are going to be saying, use Windows 7, it's a lighter. No, use Windows 8, it's newer and light as well. No, use Linux, it's a lot better, especially Linux Tiny Core. No, Linux Tiny Core is too simple, use Ubuntu. No, use Linux Mint or Windows 11, they are much better. But I'm just using Windows 10 because it's the most popular operating system out there, and, well, it's the operating system that I have on that SSD. I could try Windows 11, but it would be a bit slower, and I could try Linux, but I don't even know how to install a web browser. Last time I tried to install a web browser on Linux, I somehow managed to delete my entire desktop. And no, I am not kidding. I think Linux hates me. Starting off, we are in GTA 5 on 720p on the lowest settings, and it was not really having a good time in GTA 5. So, it was getting a stuttery 17 frames per second on average, though the average frame rate didn't exactly add up to anything because the lows were far below 5. They were 0. That is bad. On top of that, we were having a problem where the map decided it didn't want to actually be a map. Instead, it wanted to be a void. What do I mean by that? Well, the map disappeared. Yes, you could see the entities on the ground, for example. You could see, for example, cars and people walking, but you couldn't exactly see the road, or the buildings, or the things you kind of need to see to play the game. Though, limiting the frame rate to something lower than what you'd normally get, like 15 or 10, you would be able to have the game not have those problems, but the problem there is it's just a slideshow. It's almost unplayable. I know some people can play the game at 10 frames per second, and no, I'm not kidding, some people can. It won't be a great experience, but it is technically playable. You just really have to be determined to play the game. Boarderlands 3 was an amazing experience. If you consider the loading copyright screen an amazing experience. If you don't, I'm sorry, then that is a horrible experience because that's all you see. A very clear image of the copyright and the credits of the game. Yeah. BioShock Infinite actually surprised me, so when I first loaded the game up at 1080p on the low settings, it was stuttering in a little bit, well, when I say a little bit, a lot, it was stuttering a lot, and it was around 40 frames per second, though I tried limiting the frame rate to around 30, and ironed out most of the stutters, and it was a pretty playable experience at 30 frames per second, if you don't mind the odd stutter here and there. I at least could play through the game with no problem here. I mean, I prefer 60 of course, but it's by no means unplayable. The next game up on the list is Fortnite on performance mode on 720p on the lowest settings. And the game got around 20 frames per second on average. It often got above 20, and often dipped far below 20. To the single digits at times. It wasn't the most playable ever. It wasn't a great experience by any means, but somehow I actually managed to come in 3rd place. I don't think that many people come in 3rd place with a single core CPU in Fortnite, so that's neat. Another thing I was going to try is DirectX 11. DirectX 11, it ran just barely. Then I tried DirectX 12 and I couldn't even get into a match, so that's something. Also, Windows updates does take a rather long time on this CPU. So, there was one, what was that called again, a cumulative update or something? Either way, it was busy doing that for over 2 hours straight, which is a rather long time to be doing an update. Most of it was on the installing process, so that's something. though it did get the job done after a while. I don't exactly understand why, though. I think I had the computer set so it would actually install updates at night, and I also checked for updates right before doing all the benchmarks, and it decided to do the update during the benchmarks. So that was nice. Thanks, Windows Update. Valorant on 1080p on the deathmatch ran, well, really weirdly. So, it was running somewhat decently, around 20 frames per second. Then I went over and tried to adjust the settings. And, well, I didn't adjust the settings, and then I went back to the game, and the game was running at, I want to say 0 frames per second, but that would actually be very inaccurate. It was running at roughly 1 frame every 20 to 30 seconds, which is rather bad, you know? So I tried restarting the computer and everything, and when I got back into the game, I vaguely remember the game running at around 25 to 30 frames per second. Though, it seems I didn't record the footage, or maybe I did and it didn't save, because I remember looking over and I had about 1 GB of space left on my recording computer's hard drive at the time of recording, so I think it just didn't save. I don't know. But yeah, I remember getting 20 to 30 frames per second. It wasn't a great experience at all, but it was running. At least better than the 20 to 30 seconds per frame before. Apex Legends at 1080p on the lowest settings with a 40 FPS adaptive target. The game was getting around 30 to 45 frames per second in the menu, but then when trying to load into a multiplayer match, the game just gives you timing out errors, and I once managed to get into the sky where you're going to, you know, fall down onto the world, you know, when you jump out of, like, I don't even know what it is. Basically, at the start of the match, the game was getting around 3 to 7 frames per second, not ideal in the slightest, and it gives you errors and times you out constantly. So, 107% unplayable. Ark Survival Evolved at 720p on the lowest settings ran poorly in the menu, and then when loading up a single player world, it just gave you an entire screen of errors. A lot of errors. It was unplayable because of all the errors, because you couldn't actually even get into the full game to actually play it. So that's interesting. BeamNG drive on the lowest settings on 1080p on the West Coast USA map, going around my entire test loop of the entire map, got around 17 frames per second average, which is not very good. It did run, it is actually playable for some people, but in general, it is not the best experience. I'm sure if you went onto a map like Grid Map, where it's very simple, and it's just basically a flat map, there's nothing there, it would likely run quite a bit better, but probably still not 30 frames per second. Now, there is something I want to say. So, when you load into the game, it actually gives you an error saying, 1 physical core is not recommended. With 1 physical core, it's not going to run well. And they are correct. With 1 physical core, it doesn't run well. And I know that for an absolute fact, because this is, as far as I'm aware, the fastest single core CPU you can possibly get, unless I'm missing one. So if it doesn't run good on this, it ain't gonna run good on any of them. Also, on my Intel Pentium G7400, it gives the same error, but it just replaced single with dual. It says it doesn't run good on a dual core. Which, okay, on some super old dual cores maybe not, like maybe Core 2 duos, but like even my i3-2120 or my Intel Pentium G7400, they run this game just fine. The Pentium gets well above 60 frames per second on every map I throw at it. The i3 gets around 45 in pretty much every single map as well, just you have to lower the settings down a little bit with the i3. Okay, I'm going way off track, let's get back to the Celeron. Brawhalla ran, well, I don't know how Brawhalla ran, to be fair, because I can't get MSI Afterburner's overlay to work, and Xbox Control Companion, whatever it's called, I can't get that to work either. on the game, so I don't know what the frame rate was, but the game felt pretty smooth. When you loaded into the map, it gave like 1 or 2 stutters, but after that, it felt fine. I'm assuming it was probably 50 to 60 frames per second. All I know is the game has a 60 frames per second frame rate cap, so it's probably somewhere in there. Either way, for what the game is, it ran just fine. Also, I don't normally test Brawhalla as well because it runs on pretty much everything. CSGO on the very low settings at 1080p was getting about 30 frames per second on average, though it was often dipping down into the low 20s and low teens, and sometimes even the middle single digits, which is not completely ideal at all. But somehow, I don't know how, I guess I'm just better at games with low frame rates. I came in first place. That is the first time I've came in first place in any CSGO game, including games where I'm getting over 100 frames per second. It's a trend. When I'm playing with low frame rates, I just seem to almost win all the games. And then, as soon as I get on a fast computer, I lose them all. I don't know what's up with that. It ran horribly, but it's clearly playable, depending on what your standards are. Dota 2, with the high texture detail and high effects quality settings all the way up, and the rest of the settings all the way at the lowest, ran at a nice, smooth 30 frames per second. There were a few stutters every once in a while, but other than that, it ran just fine. Now, if I didn't have the frame rate capped, it did feel a little bit jittery because it'd be going to like 50, going to 29, going to 50, going to 29 every few seconds, but just limiting the frame rate. Then it just stayed consistent and the game felt just fine. I don't know how to play the game, but there was a lot going on screen it seemed, so if it were to drop, I think it would have. So yeah, Dota 2, I'd say, is perfectly playable, as long as you're fine with 30 frames per second. Halo Infinite took 2 hours to load. I'm not okay, I am somewhat exaggerating. It took 1 hour and 57 minutes to load, and we didn't get into a match. The game was at 1080p on the low settings with a 32 frames per second target, but none of that matters if you can't even get into the match. So yeah, that's neat. Team Fortress 2 at 1080p on the lowest settings was getting about the same frame rate as CSGO, though the 1% lows felt higher than CSGO, but on the meter it showed they were lower. Either way, it was playable. It was getting around 20 to 30 frames per second. It just wasn't an ideal experience, but if you were determined, you could play the game like this, I'd say. Unless you get a headache from low frame rates or something, then maybe not. But otherwise, I'd say the game is playable, but definitely not recommended. Fall Guys at 1080p on the low settings was questionably playable. Since the game doesn't exactly need that high reaction times, it might be playable because it was getting into the high 20s most of the time, especially in the later rounds of the game. But when you first start the map, when you have all the players right in your view, you're getting around 20 or less. It's above 10 most of the time, almost all of the time, but it really just depends what you consider playable. I could play the game like this for at least a few minutes, but not for several hours though. Probably give me a headache or something. Minecraft Java 1.19 with Optifine with all the lowest settings besides the render distance at 4 chunks. The game was getting between 5 frames per second or less and 30. It really depended if you tried to move. As soon as you try to move, you basically stutter like crazy and the game's almost unplayable. Though, here's the thing. Some people, not many, but some people actually might be able to play the game like this. I've seen some people, in fact, play the game for some almost years at around 6 frames per second. So, it's not ideal in the slightest, but if you're determined, I guess it'd be fine. maybe. Also, I'm not trying sodium because sodium stutters like crazy with slower CPUs compared to Optifine. I don't know why. Sodium's supposed to be faster, but it's not in all cases. So we're just using Optifine here. Minecraft Bedrock on 1080p on a mix of medium settings and also 8 chunks render distance. The game ran around 40 to 50 frames per second, which is not bad. Also, it did hit 60 times as well. I tried blowing up 1000 TNT, and it didn't like that. I think it's 1000, right? 10 times 10 times 10. Yeah, it's 1000. So yeah, I went over and blew up 1000 TNT. It didn't like that at all. But it got the job done and it didn't crash the game, so if all you want to play is Minecraft Bedrock, this handles it just fine. But for some reason, when you try to join some servers like CubeCraft, the frame rate goes from that roughly 60 down to like 30 to 40, sometimes 50s. So you lose about 10 frames per second going onto a server. Even on the servers, one of the easiest runs to map on the server, which is Skywars. So yeah, that's something. Roblox Arsenal at 1080p on the lowest Roblox Arsenal settings and the lowest Roblox settings was a surprise. I was expecting the game to run decently because it's Roblox. No, it was getting often into the low single digits, like 3 frames per second. Yes, 3. The higher end would be about 25. It was getting about 15 frames per second average, and all in all, it is not a very good experience at all. And also, here are some quick little benchmarks. So, Cinebench R23 on the multi-core test. The single core is blanked out. I cannot do a single core R23 test, only multi-core. It got a score of 476, which is a few points more than my AMD Athlon X2 5600 Plus. But this also performs significantly better than the AMD Athlon X2 5600 Plus, which is somewhat of a surprise because this only has 1 core and 2 threads, versus the AMD CPU has 2 cores and 2 threads. But one way or another, the single core wins, which is quite neat. Also in 3D Mark Basic Edition Time Spy, the CPU got a score of 427, and the graphics score got a score of 1397. Now, keep in mind, the graphics score for this test was done after I did all of the video recording in the games, so I was using a GTX 750 Ti for the graphics score. But that shouldn't matter, we're here for the CPU score anyway, so the graphics shouldn't really affect the CPU score, especially since the CPU is so slow. I actually also plan on continuing to use the Celeron in my media computer, if you want to call it that. The reason why is because all I need the computer to do is be able to get onto YouTube and also record my capture card with OBS. This barely can record with OBS with my capture card, but it can. So I'm probably going to just use it. Keep in mind, I'm using NVIC. If I wasn't using NVIC on my 750 Ti, it would not like that at all. No, it's not going to work otherwise. But it's able to keep up with NVIC, so it's able to do everything I need, and only uses 10 watts. Do I recommend you to go out and get the fastest single-core CPU you can possibly get? Well, no. And maybe. So, here, let me explain. If you need a very, very, very low-powered computer, it has to be the LGA 1155 socket. Yeah, the Celeron will do fine. It uses 10 watts or less. So I got the i3 2120 for free, but they are on sale on eBay for about $6. The Celeron I bought for $3 on eBay. Except now the Celeron sells for around $8 on eBay. So the Celeron is more than the i3. The i3 gets over double the performance. So if you want any sort of performance, get the i3. Especially if you don't care about the power usage that much, because the i3 doesn't use much more. But if you just want to do some web browsing, which this can do pretty decently, just opening 2 applications at once, like opening Discord and Google, for example, it does bring the computer to a crawl, but once you get the web browser open, you're able to web browse just fine, and especially if you have ad block. Ad block helps a ton with that. But basically, if you're just doing web browsing, or maybe playing Dota or Minecraft Bedrock or Solitaire or Brawhalla, something like that, where it's incredibly easy to run, this will do just fine. But don't get it to play Cyberpunk. I wonder, how would it run Cyberpunk?